Well, thank you very much, and I'm really pleased to be here. I really find speaking to you in the League of Women Voters very rewarding, and I'm going to look forward to your questions. I was asked to speak about the connection between water and our use of water in the environment. And so I'm going to just touch on a couple of very simple ideas, and I'm going to start with the caveat that I'm absolutely positively not covering everything. Can't be done. I'd need at least 2 days. That means rivers and streams, often captured in reservoirs, but they're just in the middle of a river or of a stream. And the other 30 to 40% comes from groundwater, water that we pump up from the ground. It varies from year to year. We tend to use more groundwater in dryish years and less in wetter years. But that's roughly the split here in California. And of course, in different areas, it also varies. Some areas are entirely dependent upon groundwater. Others have plentiful surface supplies, so they never touch their groundwater. Groundwater in California is actually a whole other topic that deserves several other days of discussion, because California stands alone, not with a great deal of pride, as pretty much the only state in the union that does not on a statewide basis regulate or monitor its groundwater resource supplies. It is done locally in some places, particularly those areas that rely heavily on groundwater, but on a statewide basis, we don't do it. And so in fact, on a statewide basis, about the only information that we really have about what's going on in our groundwater basins comes from outer space. It comes from NASA and their satellites. This is actually an older map than that, but it's a nice depiction of, this is the Central Valley groundwater aquifers here, and the colors are showing you the extent to which those aquifers are being depleted, which means more water is being taken out over time than is being replenished into those groundwater basins. California has an extremely serious problem in the southern San Joaquin Valley. That's where the greatest groundwater depletion is going on. That's where that subsidence photo that Elizabeth just showed you came from. That's where we don't get a lot of rain. And that's where there's a lot of agriculture, and they do rely on it to some extent. So we have big problems in groundwater. Groundwater is not, it doesn't go on forever. Once you've depleted an aquifer, it's gone. The deeper the aquifer goes down and the deeper you have to pump your well, the more energy and money it costs you to get it out. I wanted to reinforce what Elizabeth said, which is that groundwater and surface water are connected to each other. And the reason is that most of the recharge that goes into our groundwater basins, particularly those that are somewhat near the surface, and now Maury may actually end up correcting me, does come from rivers. It basically is infiltrating into the ground, particularly when rivers inundate floodplains. Of course, it also happens on a more localized level. But part of the reason that we have such problems with groundwater in the southern San Joaquin Valley is that we have depleted our rivers as well. So in fact, we're reducing the rate at which we're recharging the groundwater. At the same time, we're taking more water out of those that are coming in. And you're seeing that we essentially have a bit of a conflict between how we're managing our surface and our groundwater supplies, especially since we don't really monitor what's going on with groundwater. But I now wanted to shift to surface waters, because with regard to the environment and environmental impacts and ecosystem function and biological resources like fisheries and birds, they're really much more interested in the surface waters because that is where they live, that is where their habitat is. It is, of course, connected to groundwater, though. This is the Sacramento-San Joaquin watershed. As Matt mentioned, it's the largest watershed in this state. It produces and provides most of the water that is used by people throughout the state, including people who live outside of this watershed. This particular map is showing the major rivers, and it's showing the places on those rivers where there's a big dam that has been built. In this case, they're all big, huge storage dams. They're built for water supply and flood control purposes. And they're marked in red, with the river upstream is marked in red because that represents the extent of the river, which is no longer accessible to fish that migrate, like salmon. So this is showing those disconnected waterways. The lower ones, let's see if I can make this work. Down in this area here, they're also shown in red because historically and in most years, those rivers were dry. And they were dried because all the water that was captured at the dam was essentially removed from the river and used elsewhere, and the river ceased to flow. So that also represented a disconnected habitat or a loss of habitat for animals like fish that rely on these things. So all of these rivers, when they flow down into the delta and into the San Francisco Bay, which, as Matt mentioned, is the largest estuary. That's the place where rivers meet the ocean on the west coast. It's a really interesting estuary for a whole variety of reasons, but of course one of the reasons it's interesting is in the upstream portion, in the delta, is where we have these big pumping facilities that pump a lot of the water that gets down into the estuary out before it actually gets into the estuary and into San Francisco Bay. So that's sort of the next part of my story that I'm going to talk about. In this watershed, if you were to measure the amount of fresh water that flowed from the watershed that actually did flow into San Francisco Bay, you'd find that it's about 50% of the total runoff and flow from from the entire watershed. About 50% of the water is removed from the system, either at the dams, from the rivers, or from the delta, before it gets into San Francisco Bay. That 50% is used in a variety of ways, but if you were to break it down in very, very coarse terms, roughly 80% of that water that has been removed from the watershed before it gets to San Francisco Bay is used for agriculture and irrigation. The other 20% is used for urban and industrial uses. That too varies a little bit from year to year, but that's roughly the split as to how we're using these surface waters in California and in this watershed. So now I want to switch, and I'm going to revert to my scientist mode, and I'm going to show you a graph. And we scientists use graphs all the time because it is the way that we think, and it's also the way that we tell stories. So I'm going to use this graph and its cousins to tell you a story about the consequences and the effects of using that water for our supply and removing it from the environment. This particular kind of graph is called a hydrograph. And essentially what it's doing is it's tracking the pattern and the timing and the amounts of flow, freshwater flow, that are flowing out of the watershed into San Francisco Bay. And this graph is plotting the flow that would have flowed into San Francisco Bay in 2012, water year 2012. You're seeing the months along the bottom there. The water year starts on October 1st. If there were no dams and no water diversions and no pumps in the delta, this is the amount of flow that would have flowed in, and this is the timing and the pattern of flow that would have flown into the bay if there weren't any dams, diversions, or pumps or anything like that. As if it were, it's not technically exactly the same as a totally natural, a historical natural system, but it's not a bad representation. So that's if there weren't any dams and diversions. This is actually what really happened in 2012 in terms of the amounts and the timing and the pattern of freshwater flow that actually did flow into San Francisco Bay. And this, the filled-in pattern, represents the water supply that we've taken out of this system. In 2012, it was almost exactly 50% of the actual unimpaired flow was removed before it got into San Francisco Bay. Now, 2012 was actually a dry year. It wasn't really, really dry, but it was dry. It was definitely below normal. And so you think, well, maybe this only happens really in dry years. Maybe that's when we need the water, it's dry, and there wasn't very much water to begin with. But in fact, it's actually happening almost all the time. Before I obviously have slipped mentally as to which slide was next, so I'm going to switch stories here and take you back to this unimpaired hydrograph here and talk about why. What are the elements and why is the shape and the pattern of this hydrograph important to the environment? And when it comes to hydrographs, the pattern, the timing, and the flow, size matters, the shape of the hydrograph, where the peaks are and how big they are matters, and the timing, when they occur in the season of the year. This is a pretty typical dry year hydrograph for California. We tend to see some early high flow events in the winter associated with rainstorms, and then this large, longer, prolonged high flow event is associated with the melting of the snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains and in the mountains of the watershed here. The amount matters. The amount of flow matters because when rivers flow at higher levels, frequently overtop their banks and extend into floodplains. And in this particular system, and for the floodplains, which are sort of on the lower levels, just upstream of the delta, you need flows of about 50,000 cubic feet per second to inundate the floodplain. We're sort of artificially managing our floodplains right now, but that's what you need these days to inundate the Yolo bypass, which is the biggest managed floodplain that we have in this system. Oops, I'm not certain it went. But of course, that's the hydrograph we got, because we've removed most of this water. So in fact, in this year, we didn't inundate the floodplain. And as we now know, because surface water and groundwater are connected, we also didn't have the opportunity to recharge the groundwater basins. The shape of the hydrograph matters, and the timing of the peaks matters to other things like reproduction. Delta smelt are really cued into the first freshet, the first high flow event that comes in the winter. And that's what they use as a signal to move upstream into the delta to begin and do their spawning migration so they can spawn a little later in the season. Cottonwoods on the rivers actually are exquisitely timed to do their seed set during the declining limb of the spring snowmelt period. They're cued into not only the timing, but the levels of flow going down, and also the rate of change going down. And that's just two examples. But of course, this is the hydrograph that we now have. So in fact, we have screwed up the various environmental and biological triggers out there that allow many of these biological resources to successfully complete their life cycles. And finally, habitat. Matt talked about the fact that part of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan is to restore a whole bunch of habitat. The trouble is, for a whole bunch of important animals that live in this system, water is habitat. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in an estuary, one of the key habitat types that is absolutely essential for most of the species, whether they're resident or migratory, is what we call low salinity habitat. That's where the fresh water mixes with the salt and you get brackish water. And in San Francisco Bay, that low salinity habitat is created in very ecologically important areas like Sassoon Bay, this big, huge, wide, expansive, shallow embayment just downstream of the delta. It's created when you get these higher flows of fresh water that push that low salinity zone down there to mix and create that kind of habitat. That habitat is essential for a whole variety of fish species, as well as for the production of phytoplankton, which is the base of the food web, the whole shebang. It's incredibly important habitat. In fact, the amount of that habitat, which you can measure in terms of the amount of flow that gets into the estuary during the spring, is statistically and directly related to the number of fish that you will count later in the season. When you get good flows, you get good fish populations. When you get low flows, fish populations go down. And of course, this is what we've got right now. So in this particular year, it was pretty crummy habitat conditions out there in terms of low salinity habitat. So I mentioned this is a dry year, and maybe this doesn't happen all the time, but in fact, not only does it happen almost all the time, it's been happening worse and worse and worse. Here's another graph. This is showing on a decadal basis the amount of that unimpaired flow that actually did get to San Francisco Bay. This is the average amount for each of the decades, starting from the 30s, going to the 2000s, the second to the right bar there, right here, and there's the last 5 years. And as you can see, the amount of fresh water that is flowing into the estuary is declining. And in fact, it is now, for the last 5 years, it's been less than 50%. This is essentially created in the estuary, as far as the estuary can tell, chronic man-made drought conditions. As far as the estuary can tell, it's a drought every year. And that's had huge consequences for the fish that rely on the estuary. This is a graph showing the trend over time in the abundance of the 6 formerly most common fish that are found in the estuary that are collected in a particular survey. And the red line across is showing, the graph is expressing the amount of fish in terms of the percent of fish compared to the average abundance of those fish from 1967 to 1991, the first 25 years of the surveys. This is basically the amount of fish that you had. In the last decade plus, populations of the fish have plummeted, and this isn't just Delta smelt, this is pretty much everything. This is the ecological collapse that Matt was talking about, and this is one of the things that's driving our need to reform the way that we're managing our water resources and the Delta itself. So, just to sort of close, what we really do know is that the current way that we're managing these water resources with regard to protecting the ecosystem as well as managing it for a reliable water supply is unsustainable. We cannot keep doing, that's part of the answer to the question that was asked to Matt. Can we keep doing what we could? Well, we could, but everything's going to collapse. It's environmentally destructive. The diversions that we're trying to take out of the system exceed the available supply, and we have conflicts between how we're managing the surface water, and it's exacerbating our groundwater problems. We haven't even talked about climate change, and we are too reliant as a state on the Delta as a source of supply. You heard about, and you will hear more about, the plan to address this with the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. This is a schematic on the right showing you where the resources are planned to be put in the Delta Plan, in the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, building the big huge tunnels. That's multi-billion dollars, doing a whole bunch of habitat restoration so that we can continue to rely on the Delta. I want to close by mentioning that recently, just a couple of weeks ago, an alternative approach was proposed by a coalition of environmental organizations and municipal water districts that says, you know, rather than putting all of our eggs, all of our water supply eggs in one basket, why don't we diversify our supply? And so this is the alternative that's being proposed, and at the moment it's being proposed just for analysis. It includes smaller tunnels, it includes more storage south of the Delta, it includes more reliance on recycling and reclaiming water, a whole variety of things. And to find out more about this, I will refer you to my colleague Barry Nelson's blog on the NRDC Switchboard website. And at that, I'm getting the hook.